Hi, everyone. Welcome to my work in progress two for my capstone project. To reintroduce what I'm going to be studying is lower body injuries in the NFL and investigating the relationship between playing surface and player injury. So again, why am I analyzing the nature of injuries and player performance in the NFL? So of course, as we all know, that injuries have been very prevalent in the NFL since the beginning. But it's my opinion that with today's technological advancements, our analytical advancements, that we we have the responsibility to try and minimize injury as much as possible. It's gotten, it's gotten to the point where some of these injuries are affecting players for the rest of their lives. And it's considered very dangerous to even step foot on the football field sometimes. So, one of the topics of great debate in terms of injuries in the NFL is whether the risk of severe injuries are higher, whether the risk of severe lower body injury rates is higher on artificial turf versus natural grass. And of course, um, the surface of the field isn't the only contributing factor towards all these injuries. So, what are some of the other major factors contributing to lower body injuries as well? That's what we're going to be looking into today. So, a little recap of the background of this project. Currently, there's 30 NFL stadiums, 2 are shared. 16 use natural grass, while the remaining 14 use artificial turf. So, why exactly are so many NFL franchises switching to artificial turf? So there's a couple of big reasons, one of which it's cost effective in the long run, and it's much easier to maintain the fields, especially during the busy NFL season. The level of maintenance is nowhere to where it was with the natural grass. It's much easier with artificial turf. There's been in the recent years, there's been investigations on lower body injuries in the NFL that demonstrate notably higher injury rates on artificial turf compared with natural grass, which is definitely concerning, despite all of the reasons that it's preferred. So, what is the NFL doing to approach this issue in the recent years since all these investigations began? One of the biggest things is there has been investigations at all that have been happening in the past few years, many more than there used to be as to the nature of these injuries, why they're happening, where they're happening, what were they doing. One of the things that was created was the Field Service Safety and Performance Committee. This was created by the NFL actually in 2016 to perform research on injuries, the nature of injuries, advise on injury prevention, improve testing methods, and they adopt new techniques to evaluate field service performance and playability. There's also been biomechanical studies of football cleat surface interactions that have been done. Studies like this have shown synthetic turf surfaces actually don't release cleats as readily as natural turf does, which can definitely contribute to the incidence of lower limb injuries. And the NFL is also using a lot of data analysis to ensure optimal player performance and safety. So they're collecting data basically on every moving player on the field. They use equipment sensors, radio frequency tags, video analysis, and they're using these results to enforce different rule changes. So there's a lot that has been being done, which is a great sign in the past few years to try and minimize these severe injuries. So now my question becomes, should analysts focus on investigating the relationship between injury on artificial turf versus injury on natural grass? Or should they be focusing on analyzing injuries on both surfaces in general and less on the relationship between injury and playing surface? And this brings me to my goal for today. How can we minimize injuries? Another reason that my goal has somewhat shifted since my last work in progress is because due to the nature of my data set, it includes only records of injuries. So there's no records of any players who were not injured. So I had to refine my goal to align more with my data set and the analysis of my data set. I didn't want to use my data set to predict whether players were injured or not when my data set only consists of injured players. So therefore, I'm going to want to determine the relationship between severity of injury and playing surface. So as opposed to whether they are injured or not, I'm going to focus on the severity of the injury itself and the playing surface. So does the playing surface have an effect on the severity of injury? Is it higher when it's on artificial turf versus natural grass? And I want to know by how much. I also want to determine the association between severity of injury and all the other variables in my data set. So there's many more contributing factors, or I should say potential contributing factors here, such as position, body part, stadium type, weather, etc. So do any of these variables heighten the severity of the injury, and by how much? And then lastly, I want to build a predictive model to help assess the different severity levels of injury for players in the NFL. And what are the contributing factors to the higher severity levels of injury versus the lower ones? And I want to use it to make recommendations for avoiding or minimizing injuries. So I know I went over my data set prior, but just to review, I got my data set from the Kaggle website. They hosted a competition in 2020 called NFL First and Future Analytics. And this included, they provide 3 CSV files that include information on 250 player in-game histories from 2 consecutive NFL regular seasons. 150 of the players represent the sample that sustained a lower limb contact injury, which is, as I'll show you in the next couple slides, one of the data sets that I'm using for my analysis today. And this is all provided by Next Gen Stats. So let me get into okay. So as I said, they provided 3 CSV files. I'm only going to be using the first 2 in this chart for my analysis. First of which is called injury record. So this data set consists of lots of different information about the injuries that happened. The second file is called play file. This data file contains information about the game, the field, and play information at the player play level. So the injury records file. This file contains, I think I misspoke before, 105 lower limb injuries. I said 150, but it contains 105 lower limb injuries that occurred during the regular season games over 2 consecutive seasons. This data set has 105 rows or observations and 9 columns and variables. So the variables are listed there. The ones in bold are, of course, the key variables for this data set. And so most are self-explanatory, but just as a reminder, the DM underscore variables they stand for days missed. So for example, days missed M1 is missed 1 day, days missed M7, that's missed 7 days, and so on and so forth. So let's see. So my second data file is the play file. So this file is much bigger, contains details for 267,000 player plays that make up the data set. This data set has 14 variables, and I listed them below. Of course, the bolded are the key variables, but there's a lot of great information in this one, and there's lots of different routes we can go with analyzing this data, but I'll go into more detail in my analysis section. Before I get into what I've done since my last work in progress, I want to review my analytical plan that was originated in my work in progress one. So prior to this, I was looking to clean and prep data, of course, incorporate any feedback that you guys all gave me for work in progress one, which thank you again for that. Fit my models. So 2 different regression models I'm going to be fitting, which again, I'll go into more detail in a couple of slides and focus on the results that I'm getting. And I really wanted to be able to identify any struggles prior to presenting this work in progress too. In order to get any feedback on how to go from here. So of course, I started with my data cleaning, and I want to start by presenting the play file data because, like I said, this one was much bigger and took me a lot longer to organize and clean. So the first thing I did had to do with the temperature variable. As I was doing a little bit of my initial visualization of the data and taking a peek at it, I did notice that temperature had some influential points and outliers. For this reason, I removed the outliers after visualizing them and agreed that they were influencing the points in a way that it wasn't useful. So the second thing I did, stadium type and weather type were similar cleaning projects. Both of these variables consisted of many different data pieces that were very repetitive. There was many duplicates, misspellings of some of the same words. So stadium, I wanted to group and define some new categorical groups. So I chose outdoor, indoor closed, and indoor open. For weather type, I chose rain, clear, overcast, controlled climate, and snow. For my injury records data set, when I started to clean it, it's a much smaller data set, so it was a little bit easier to work with. But so starting with some of the variables I wanted to clean up, the body part variable. As you can see, the ankle and knee variable, the ankle and the knee variables, most of the injuries consisted of knee and ankle injuries, and then it was followed by foot, toes, and heel. So since ankle and knee made up most of the injuries, I chose to group foot, toes, and heels together into one category called other. So on the left is what it looked like before, and on the right is what it looked like after. Another thing I cleaned up for my analysis was from the injury records data set was the DM underscore days missed data. So these binary variables, again, are standing for how many days that were missed post-injury. And the thing I noticed is the number of days out due to the injury indirectly portrayed the severity of the injury, because of course, the worse the injury is, the longer we're going to stay out from playing. And so I chose to create a severity variable called severity, and it has an ordinal scale. So I had 4 different levels. Of course, level 1 represented DM underscore M1, level 2 DM underscore M7, and so on. So level 1 represented the least severe, while level 4 represented the most severe. And lastly, after I was done cleaning both data sets, I chose to combine the playlist data set and the injury records data into one data file to use and perform analysis on. So I definitely needed to visualize and understand my data. prior to performing any analysis. I wanted to take a peek at what I was working with first. So because we are going to be focusing on different surfaces, natural versus synthetic, I wanted to know exactly how many observations were taken on natural grass versus synthetic turf. So as you can see, 48 observations were from natural grass, while 57 were from synthetic surfaces. So when I say observations, I mean records of injury. So the injuries that occurred. So to further evaluate the surface variable here, I provided two different graphs that I looked at to visualize the surface and body part. So on the left, you can see the type of injury. So the body part that was injured based on what surface. And that one wasn't too bad. There wasn't a large discrepancy, or there wasn't a large difference in synthetic and natural surfaces based on, type of injury that occurred. They were somewhat equal, closer to the middle. And for surface and severity of injury, so this interested me a little bit more, especially since I was looking to investigate the severity of injuries based on surface that was played on. So the severity of injuries on synthetic surfaces obviously appear worse when compared to the severity of injuries on natural surfaces. As you can see, synthetic surface definitely has a greater share at severity levels 1, 3, and 4, but most definitely 3, which is one of the more severe injuries. Because of a lot of things I was seeing, for example, this chart on the right, I did hypothesize that the playing surface was going to have an association with the severity of injury, or how severe it was. Again, level 1 being the least severe, level 4 being the most severe. So this was very interesting. So after I figured out how many games were played, and I wanted to compare games played on both surfaces versus number of injuries on both surfaces. So, as you can see, even though there was many, many more games played on natural grass, there were more injuries that were happening on synthetic turf, as you can see on the bottom portion. So I concluded that the assumption that there's a relationship between playing surface and severity of injury does appear to be right. From what I was seeing throughout my data, there did appear to be an influence of surface on the severity levels of injury. So after taking a big look at my data and the patterns throughout my data, this definitely caused a shift in my analytical mindset prior to performing my analysis. As I mentioned in the beginning, the data selection, I only have injury records alone. So I had to shift my mindset more to studying the injuries as opposed to predicting whether they were going to be injured or not. So hence why I chose to focus a little bit more on the severity of injuries. My focus shifts to evaluating the relationship between injuries themselves and contributing factors, such as playing surface, as opposed to evaluating the relationship between whether someone gets injured or not. So like I just said, so some ideas for analysis were surface and severity of injury, surface and injury type, such as body part. And what are some key takeaways so far? So from the chart that I showed, from the graph that I showed you prior, although more games are played on natural surfaces, more injuries are occurring on the turf than natural surfaces, which is not a good thing. It's not a good sign. When we look at surface's role in severity, synthetic has definitely shown to be the upper hand over natural surfaces, just from our preliminary analysis and visualization of the data. So at this point, I would like to build a regression model for severity as there's many factors involved in player injuries. So my goal is to understand and identify key factors behind the severity of player injury. So as I prepared to build my model, I chose to go with regression analysis. My first analysis that I performed, multiple linear regression that included all the variables in the combined data set that I created. My target variable was going to be severity. So what were some of the contributing factors towards severity of injuries? So I provided a little description of the results I received. I was excited to see that I did have a significant model with a great adjusted R-squared value. And specifically, just to take a look at the assessment of the model in under results summary, the residual standard error was very low, and which was great to see, meaning that the model fits the data well. I also, from the R-squared, you can see that the higher value is closer to 1, which indicates that a larger proportion of the variability in the outcome has been explained by my regression model, which was great to see. And from the model, I saw that based on the p-values of the coefficients in the model, I'm using the significance level 0.05, I found that surface, position, and body part were significant factors contributing to the severity of injuries among the injured players. Just a note, I did, when I was done using all these variables, one thing I thought about was wanting to focus more on the surfaces themselves and how the surface affects the severity of injuries. So in my second regression analysis, I chose to do just a simple linear regression to test the association between surface variable and severity of injury. So the target variable would still be severity here. After running this model, I deduced a couple of reasons why it would not have been successful as my model using all the variables in the data set. As you can see there, my residual standard error for this model was not as small as I would like it to be, which is not a great indication that the model fits the data well. And the R-squared value, on the contrary, this time the R-squared value is far away from 1 and quite small, which does indicate that this regression model did not explain much of the variability in the outcome. So this caused me to ask, why do I think this model did not perform as well? Relationship did not portray as significant, despite those initial results I was seeing with surface and severity of injury. So before I talk about my change to my timeline, I just wanted to mention that I can tell by just that running this model and the nature of the variables, the severity and surface variables to be exact, I would want to consider maybe another form of analysis if I wanted to specifically assess the relationship between these two variables, just because of the nature of them. Of course, surface is categorical, severity of injury had levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it may not be the best decision to go this route for this analysis in terms of finding the relationship between the two. So that's definitely something I included at the end of my presentation that I would definitely look for feedback on. This is probably where I need input the most, because this was one of I wanted to centralize in on this relationship after doing an analysis on all of the variables together. So if you have any recommendations, please feel free to leave them. So now saying that, okay. So after performing this preliminary analysis and taking a peek at the relationships between variables here, I've kind of adjusted my analytical plan and timeline. So I'm going to be researching new methods needed to fill some analytical gaps in my analysis. I still want to explore those two variables, so possibly retool analysis, of course, incorporate any feedback and recommendations I receive from you all from work in progress too. And I want to be finalizing and finalizing my analysis and my results within the next week and week 8. Try and see if I have any last minute questions, make an appointment if needed. I want to be summarizing my results and finalizing them hopefully at that point and preparing the final needs for this project. So like I said, these are some of my current struggles and requests for feedback. The biggest being some of the analytical gaps I had when trying to assess relationships with those types of variables. I think that's why I wasn't as successful with my second analysis. But if you have any thoughts or recommendations for me, I would really appreciate it. And again, I want to thank you all for all of the great feedback you gave me for my work in progress one. It definitely fueled my work in progress too. And if you have any miscellaneous thoughts or recommendations about the way I'm going with my analysis, please feel free to leave them here. And yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you all so much, and I will speak with you soon. Thank you.